This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Get ready, because today we're digging into a fascinating set of reports and analyses you shared with us, all focused on a really central piece of Nepal's economy and society: the cooperative sector, known as Sahakari. And look, this isn't just some dry economic topic. What jumps out from these sources is this real tension. On one side, you see Sahakari as this potential powerhouse for growth, woven into rural life, helping people get access to finance. But then the other side of the coin, these reports point towards some pretty serious risks kind of lurking beneath the surface, risks that maybe, just maybe, could affect Nepal's overall financial stability. So our mission here is to walk you through these insights, unpack all that complexity, and help you see what's really going on. The scale we're talking about is just massive. Sahakari goes way back, formally starting in the 1950s, and now you find them in pretty much every single local government area across Nepal. Just think about that kind of reach. They're not just like financial institutions, they're part of the community fabric.
Exactly. And that deep community tie is why the sources really emphasize Sahakari at its best as an untapped engine for inclusive growth. I mean, what really stands out is their long history and continued focus on agriculture. Agriculture is just so fundamental in Nepal. You've got, around 65% of the population working in it, and it contributes something like 24 to 31% of GDP. So yeah, huge.
Wow.
And the cooperatives, they're absolutely critical in that space. The material we looked at suggests they provide something like 30% of all the lending that goes into agriculture.
30%? That's significant.
It really is. But it's not just about the loans, They're also major suppliers of essential inputs. Think seeds, fertilizers. Plus, they actively promote modern farming techniques. So this directly boosts productivity, boosts incomes, especially for smaller farms.
Right, helping the little guys.
Precisely. And that agricultural role ties straight into financial inclusion. I mean, for lots of marginalized farmers, maybe people without much collateral, traditional banks are often just out of reach.
Yeah, makes sense.
So cooperatives fill that crucial gap. They give access to credit, to basic financial services for groups who might otherwise be excluded. It helps break down those barriers, tackles poverty, especially out in the rural areas. And think about this. Nepal's overall financial literacy rate is only about 57.9%. So the accessibility of these cooperatives, they're often the first, maybe the only, point of contact people have with the formal financial system.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the sources even cite specific examples. There was a study back in 2017 by NACCFL, that's the Nepal Agricultural Cooperative Central Federation, which found cooperative members actually had higher crop yields and better incomes than non-members. And you see partnerships too, like the Geokrishi project, working with farmer coops on things like climate-resilient farming, using digital tech right there on the ground.
Okay, wow. So yeah, looking at it that way, especially for rural Nepal where most people live and work, these cooperatives are clearly fundamental. They're providing that access, that support, where maybe the big banks aren't. It's a really positive story of local impact, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And that's a vital piece of the puzzle. But like you said at the start, there's definitely another side to this. The sources are pretty blunt about the potential for Sahakari to morph into a, quote, hidden threat to financial stability.
Right.
And because the sector is so big and interconnected, it's not just about one or two coops having problems. It could ripple outwards. The analysis sort of breaks down the risks into different buckets. Let's start with the purely financial ones. A major concern flagged is asset quality specifically, non-performing loans, NPLs.
Okay, bad loans, basically.
Exactly, loans where people aren't paying back.
Oh.
Now, the sources show this worrying trend in Nepal's commercial banks. Their NPLs have climbed quite a bit, hitting nearly 5% by mid-April 2025.
Which is high.
It is concerning, yeah. And here's the tricky part for cooperatives. The source material doesn't give us comprehensive NPL figures specifically for them. But think about it. They lend heavily to agriculture, which is vulnerable, right? Weather, prices.
Unpredictable.
And they often lend to borrowers who might be seen as higher risk by traditional banks. Now, that's great for inclusion, but if it's not managed super carefully, it suggests the NPL problem in the cooperative sector could be just as bad, maybe even worse.
So the very fact we don't have solid data on their NPLs, that's a risk in itself, like flying blind a bit.
Exactly, you've hit it. It makes it incredibly hard to gauge the sector's real health. Problems can fester unseen until, boom, it's too late. The sources also mention worries about liquidity, having enough cash on hand for withdrawals and capital adequacy that buffer against losses. If asset quality deteriorates, both of those come under pressure, particularly for the smaller coops. And underpinning a lot of this is, frankly, a lack of transparency. How some cooperatives report their finances, how they manage things, it can be quite opaque. The reports mention issues with how agricultural subsidies channeled through coups are used or potentially misused. This lack of clarity hides problems and, well, it erodes trust.
Okay, so we're painting a picture here of potentially shaky foundations, maybe some hidden cracks, and it's all made worse because we can't always see clearly what's going on inside.
It's a good way to put it. And that leads us straight into operational and management risks. These are often tangled up with some specific cultural factors in Nepal. One concept the sources bring up repeatedly is afnomanchi.
Afnomanchi, our people, right?
Roughly, yeah. It describes how informal networks, personal connections, influence decisions. Now, connections matter everywhere, but in business and governance, it can slide into nepotism. Decisions on hiring, or crucially on who gets a loan, might be based on who you know, not necessarily on merit or sound financial judgment.
Ah, okay. So you might approve a loan not because the business plan is solid, but because the borrower is like your cousin's friend.
That's the potential danger, yes. And the sources suggest this culture, maybe combined with other Nepalese cultural traits like hierarchy and respect for elders, can make it hard for people to speak up, to challenge decisions, or raise red flags.
Which ties into that saving face idea, too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Avoiding open discussion of problems to maintain appearances. And here's where it creates direct financial risk.
Yeah.
The sources talk about the potential for evergreening related party loans.
Evergreening.
Yeah, it's where a loan to someone connected, maybe someone who isn't repaying, just gets rolled over or refinanced. It makes the loan look like it's performing okay on the books, but really it's hiding a bad debt. It's a direct consequence of that afnomanchi influence and the lack of transparency, making those NPL blind spots even deeper. Then there's the challenge of staff and management skills within the cooperatives. Nepal generally struggles with a shortage of trained financial professionals. The sources note that training isn't always hitting the mark, and coupled with low levels of financial and digital literacy nationwide, well, it creates this double vulnerability, meaning members might not fully grasp the financial products or risks, and at the same time, the staff might lack the expertise to manage risks properly or implement strong internal controls. And weak controls, lack of expertise, that opens the door to fraud and cyber threats. Cyber attacks on financial institutions are rising everywhere, Nepal included. Cooperatives, maybe especially smaller ones trying to digitalize without huge resources for security, could be tempting targets. Plus, internal fraud is always a risk when governance is weak, and that afnomanchi culture can make it harder to detect or address.
Wow, okay. It really does sound like a confluence of factors. Cultural norms, potentially undermining good governance, skill gaps, plus vulnerability to external threats like cybercrime. And this doesn't just stay local, right? It adds up.
Absolutely. These aren't just isolated issues in one coup here or there. Given the sector's size and reach, these weaknesses can have systemic implications affecting the broader financial system. Their links to other financial institutions, even indirect ones, mean trouble in the cooperative sector could potentially spread. The IMF, for instance, has specifically mentioned concerns about troubled savings and credit cooperatives because of this systemic risk potential. And all this happens within a challenging, wider environment. Things like chronic political instability. It means policies chop and change, regulatory bodies shift, and there's always the potential for political interference, which can weaken governance even further. Macroeconomic factors play a role too. Delays in government spending, shifts in remittance flows. These can hit the borrowers, farmers, small businesses, making it harder for them to repay loans, which then puts stress back onto the cooperatives. And those cultural factors we talked about, afnomanchi, saving face, they're not just minor quirks. They're deeply ingrained societal norms that fundamentally shape how these institutions operate, or sometimes fail to operate effectively, especially around things like accountability and transparency.
So it's like the coups themselves are navigating this really complex web. Internal problems get tangled up with big picture economics, politics, and even deep-seated cultural norms. Definitely not a simple fix.
Far from it. And trying to manage all that complexity needs clear rules and effective oversight, the regulatory and supervisory framework. Here, the sources are, well, pretty critical. They describe the current system as fragmented.
Fragmented how?
Well, instead of one clear rule book, cooperatives might fall under different laws, different bodies. There's the Cooperative Act, but then parts of the Nepal Rashtra Bank, the Central Bank, NRB, maybe the Insurance Authority, the Securities Board. It depends on exactly what they're doing.
Oh, so confusion.
Confusion, yeah. Duplication of effort sometimes, gaps other times. And it creates opportunities for what's called regulatory arbitrage, basically, trying to structure things to fall under the least strict rules. On top of that structural issue, the bodies doing the supervising often struggle to be effective. The sources mention familiar problems, bureaucracy, allegations of corruption in some government areas, and that political instability we mentioned, which disrupts consistent oversight. The IMF has specifically suggested strengthening the NRB's own governance and independence. Political meddling just weakens the regulator's ability to enforce rules properly.
So the watchdogs might not have enough teeth, or their leash is too short.
That's one way to look at it. And it makes it really hard to ensure cooperatives are actually meeting basic safety standards, prudential standards, things like minimum capital, risk management rules. I mean, look, even the commercial banks, which are more tightly regulated, are seeing rising NPLs. It suggests it's even tougher for cooperatives facing less stringent oversight. And a really significant vulnerability that gets highlighted is around anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing AML-CFT. You might know Nepal was recently put on the FATF gray list.
Right, I heard about that.
That signals serious shortcomings in tackling money laundering and terrorist financing. And the concern is that cooperatives, especially those handling lots of cash or with weak internal controls, could potentially be misused for these illicit activities. This isn't just an internal risk. It damages Nepal's standing internationally.
Okay, let me translate that. Basically, the system's meant to keep everything safe and catch problems. They're not really firing on all cylinders. The rules are maybe a bit muddled, and the enforcement can be weak or influenced by politics. It sounds like reform isn't just a nice to have, it's pretty crucial.
Absolutely essential, yes. And that need for reform definitely extends to how the government itself supports the sector. The sources take a hard look at state support programs. Things like the Prime Minister's Agricultural Modernization Project, PAMMP, that's got a massive NPR $130 billion budget over 10 years. And then there are the agricultural subsidies, another NPR $107 billion over 5 years.
Huge sums of money.
Enormous. And cooperatives are designated as key partners, key channels for getting the support out there. PMMP, for example, channels billions through coops and farmer groups. Billions more budgeted annually for agriculture often flow through the sector. But, and it's a big but, the analysis is quite scathing about the effectiveness of all this spending. Report after report suggests the subsidies often just don't reach the small intended farmers.
Why not? Where does it go?
Well, the sources point to a mix of things. Cumbersome bureaucracy, a real lack of transparency in distribution, poor management within the channels, which often includes the coops themselves, and yes, corruption. One report from 2018 estimated maybe up to 35% could be lost to commissions.
35%?
Essentially, yes. And political connections often mean larger, wealthier landowners tend to benefit more than smallholders. Big flagship programs like PMP are described in some assessments as having implementation that's far from satisfactory.
Hang on, so we're pumping billions into agriculture, aiming to help small farmers, using coops as the pipeline, but a huge chunk might be leaking out or going to the wrong people entirely. That's staggering.
It's deeply frustrating when you read it, yes. A massive missed opportunity for that inclusive growth we talked about earlier. And the structure of the subsidies gets criticized too. Like there's a heavy bias towards chemical fertilizers, about 81% of the subsidy spend. Much less support for sustainable methods, organic farming, diversification, which raises long-term questions about soil health, import dependency, and climate resilience.
And I guess this creates a vicious circle.
You got it. Cooperatives are supposed to be these effective delivery channels, but if they suffer from weak governance, lack of transparency, skills gaps, they can end up actually perpetuating or even worsening the inefficiency and potential corruption in these state programs.
It really drives home how interconnected it all is. Problems inside the coops aren't just internal affairs. They directly impact national development efforts.
Precisely. Which brings us back to that widest context. The Sahakari sector doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by everything happening in Nepal. Think about remittances, the money sent home by Nepalists working overseas. It's a huge factor, anywhere from 21% to over 30% of GDP. We're talking over $1 trillion NPR in recent months. This flood of cash boosts demand, provides savings, potential capital for cooperatives.
Okay, that sounds positive.
It can be. But there are potential downsides too. Economists worry about Dutch disease, the strong currency making Nepali goods, including farm products, less competitive internationally. It might also reduce the incentive for people to stay and work in agriculture, impacting the very sector many coops serve. And that chronic political instability we keep mentioning, it's not just background noise. It actively disrupts consistent policymaking, affects regulatory bodies, makes long-term planning difficult, and, as we said, can worsen the Afno-Manchi problem through political interference. Then there are the basic infrastructure constraints. Poor roads, unreliable electricity, patchy internet access, especially outside the main cities, these directly hamper cooperatives. They raise transport costs for farmers, make it harder to adopt digital banking solutions, and might even inadvertently encourage less transparent cash-based practices simply because the digital infrastructure isn't reliable. And finally, looping back to those sociocultural aspects Afto Manchi's saving phase. They aren't just abstract concepts. They are, according to these sources, fundamental cultural realities, influencing everyday behavior within these institutions, affecting risk-taking, openness, accountability, the whole 9 yards.
So the coups really are like a reflection of Nepal itself, wrestling with these huge national challenges, economic, political, infrastructural, cultural, all while trying to serve their members on the ground. It is an incredibly complex system.
It truly is.
Yeah.
And the sources kind of pull all these threads together in their key takeaways and recommendations, suggesting a way forward. The core message seems to be, yes, Sahakari has this undeniable, massive potential for driving inclusive growth, especially in rural areas.
There's always a but.
There's a big but. This potential is seriously hampered, maybe even threatened, by these deep interconnected risks we've discussed: financial, operational, governance, regulatory, systemic. Tackling these isn't simple. It needs a comprehensive, coordinated effort. The recommendations generally fall into these categories. First, improving legislation and supervision. This means clear, uniform safety rules for financial coops, boosting the capacity and, crucially, the independence of the regulators, maybe even a dedicated regulator, or at least much better coordination. Moving to a risk-based approach so oversight focuses where the danger is greatest, and urgently strengthening those AML-CFT controls, especially with that FATF gray list situation. Second, raising governance and risk management internally. Things like setting minimum qualifications for managers and board members, requiring standard risk management policies, insisting on genuinely independent audits, and actively finding ways to counter the negative effects of Afno Manchi through transparency and checks and balances. Third, developing financial and digital literacy. This means serious investment in education for cooperative members, so they understand the products and risks, and for staff so they have the skills to manage effectively and use digital tools properly. Fourth, stimulating tech adoption. Providing practical support for cooperatives to digitalize, maybe technical assistance, advice, perhaps using things like the NRB's regulatory sandbox to test innovations safely, and also using COOPs to promote appropriate, modern, sustainable agricultural technology. And fifth, reforming state support. This is a big one. Radically increasing transparency and accountability in how subsidy money and program funds are distributed. Rethinking the whole subsidy structure to better support long-term sustainable agriculture, not just pumping in chemicals. And ensuring support actually reaches the small farmers it's intended for, cutting out waste and corruption. And the sources are clear. None of this happens without real political will. It means tackling entrenched interests, informal practices, corruption head-on. But if these challenges are met, the potential is enormous. Even finding ways to channel those huge remittance flows into productive local investment, provided the cooperatives become trustworthy, well-managed vehicles for that. Strengthening Sahakari isn't just about fixing COOPs. It's part of improving Nepal's whole business environment, governance, and infrastructure.
Right. So that powerful engine for inclusive growth is definitely there, a real lifeline for so many people. But right now, it feels like it's sputtering a bit, weighed down by all these tangled challenges, from cultural norms right through to national regulation and how government money is spent. Unlocking its full potential seems to require this really focused, concerted effort on multiple fronts to clear away those obstacles. And that really brings us towards the end of our deep dive today into Nepal's Sahakari sector. What a fascinating, complex picture, exactly. A clear example of how these local institutions are caught up in national issues, cultural dynamics, even global money flows. Understanding all that is just so crucial if you want to grasp what's happening with development and finance in a place like Nepal. We really hope this exploration, based on the materials you provided, has offered you some valuable perspective. Thanks so much for joining us on the Deep Dive.
And maybe just one final thought to leave you with, something to chew on based on everything we've discussed. Given how deeply rooted cultural factors like Afno Manchi and saving face are in Nepal, and how the sources show they directly impact governance and transparency within cooperatives, how fundamentally different does the approach to regulation, to supervision, to internal controls need to be? I mean, can we just import international best practices and expect them to work perfectly? Or does the approach need to be much more creatively adapted to the specific Nepali context to actually be effective, to foster real accountability, and critically, to build the deep trust that's needed for this vital sector to truly fulfill its potential? The opportunity for Sahakari is immense, no doubt about it, but realizing that opportunity seems to hinge on finding answers that work within Nepal's unique reality, while still upholding those core principles of sound governance and financial prudence.